Well, a very good warm welcome to you all here this afternoon. It's my very pleasure to be able to welcome you to Glasgow Talks on Climate and Tech with Mark Logan. Now, for those of you who don't know, my name's Alice McRae and I'm Senior Director here at Glasgow Chamber of Commerce, and I'm going to be able to host Mark today, and I'm looking forward very much to the discussion, and we will be opening up for questions once Mark has given his overview this afternoon. So please do get your questions ready and we will bring them in for Mark during the course of today's session. As Mark just said, as Alan has just said, I should say, if you are in the room now and are all connected up, it'd be super if you could just put yourselves on mute, please, just to help us with the sound quality. That would be really helpful. So a warm welcome again, and it's just terrific also to have the ongoing support from the University of Glasgow Adam Smith Business School and the Clydesdale Bank, who are our sponsors for this Glasgow Talks series. And as I've said today, I'm delighted to be able to welcome Mark. So Mark came and spoke at our Glasgow Talks in September last year, which I have to say does feel like an extraordinarily long time ago now, and so much has happened since then, and that was following the launch of his Scottish Technology Review, and I suspect that Mark will give us an update on his thinking on the recommendations that he gave in that report last year. Now, we had a very positive member response to the content of that report, and there was general consensus on the priorities that he outlined for the Scottish Government. And I think there's particular traction about the importance of a vibrant startup sector and how we really desperately need that, and for how we improve how tech is taught in our education systems. And that's certainly something that at the Chamber we've been able to embrace since Mark was with us last September, through the work of our Developing Young Workforce Glasgow team, who've basically created a project offering into the schools, secondary schools in Glasgow, called Digital Critical Friends. And that's been working with nearly 20 tech companies, the likes of Amazon, Adobe, Morgan Stanley, and so on. And that's basically to get a digital critical friend into all secondary schools with a view to helping to influence the curriculum and to see computing science positioned in the school curriculum in a comparable level to that of maths and physics. And that's the underlying ambition of that, as well as showing the different pathways and opportunities for young people to go into the workforce. So that was launched earlier this year and has been doing a power of work and is now being rolled out across Metropolitan West region here in Scotland. And is indeed part of our COP26 educational legacy, My Climate Path, because as we're going to hear today, tech will be a huge enabler on the climate challenge and how we come up with solutions to help with that. So the Chamber basically fully supported Mark's report last year, and today I'm going to just give you a few words about Mark and his background before I hand over to Mark. So Mark was hugely involved as a founder of Skyscanner, which I'm sure will be no need for any explanation to Skyscanner, a unicorn business. And that always tickles me, the reference to unicorn, but unicorn business based in Edinburgh. And he's now a tech investor and a general advocate. He's also a professor of computing science at the University of Glasgow. Now, his tech report last year for the Scottish Government outlined how Scotland could build a world-class tech ecosystem through a series of measures about education and talent, infrastructure, and funding. And those were the three main headings. And I guess we'll touch on some of that today. And Scotland has got some of the pieces in place, but basically it all needs to be integrated and the missing parts tackled. He stressed in his report that the recommendations needed to be delivered in their entirety. The report was welcomed as ambitious, and it's aimed to make the tech sector here world class, and that's certainly the ambition, and Glasgow wishes to have an instrumental role in that ambition. Very carefully thought through, and there's a range of practical and actionable recommendations. So we're delighted to continue with our support to Mark and his ambitions through that report. This session today, however, is also about a world-class ecosystem and tech and how that can help with the challenges of climate change, which are very much at the forefront of everybody's mind at the moment, particularly as we are literally nearly on the eve of COP being hosted in this fine city. So perception sometimes that green tech can mean building wind turbines and heat pumps, and they of course are hugely important in their own right, but there's also a much wider range of opportunities in the tech space, such as material passports, big data, mobility as a service, and so on, all of which could have a part to play. And that's just the ideas that have been invented at the moment, never mind the ones that are all likely to be coming through as we transition in the next 10 years. So I'm delighted to welcome Mark again today, and as we're going to explore tech's role in helping address climate change alongside his ambitions for our country and ideally Glasgow to be a serious global player in the tech arena. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Mark, who's going to give us his address today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison, and good afternoon, everybody. Just bear with me while I share my screen here. Hopefully you can see that. So I've called this presentation A Tale of Two Exponentials because on this planet right now, we are in a race between two exponentials. The first is the climate exponential as we barrel towards catastrophe in the coming years. And the second is the technology exponential, that if we can deploy that alongside other significant measures, we can mitigate that catastrophe to hopefully a large extent. And whichever exponential wins that race will determine whether or not our grandchildren are born into chaos and disorder and conflict in just a couple of generations' time. So we're going to explore these two exponentials in this brief discussion today. And we're also going to look at Scotland's part in that race. And, you know, it's worth remembering that unfortunately, Scotland is a major contributor to the original problem. We were pioneers of steam and its exploitation and coal and oil. So I think we do have a responsibility to play an outsized part in trying to now close that coming catastrophe down as best we can. And I think we can, and we'll talk about that in this presentation and also hopefully in our discussion to follow. But let's first of all just remind ourselves, you know, what we mean by an exponential. So this is an exponential, and I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with the basic idea there. The thing that's interesting about exponentials is that for the first half of them, they feel like nothing's changing. Even although every period something is doubling, it feels either unchanged or it feels very linear. We kind of imagine exponentials to be like the dotted line continuing over to the right there. And that's because the doublings in the early days are super small. So doubling something really small is still small, but eventually that process catches up with us. And as we get to the heel of this curve, suddenly we enter the second stage where we start to experience bewildering change. And we, of course, as a species, as a planet, are still, but certainly in recent years have experienced such an exponential with COVID. And I think we all remember these kind of scenarios. This is, of course, Donald Trump. And on the left, these are his statements about coronavirus in the first few months of the outbreak, so back to January 2020. And you can see from these patterns of statement, you know, there's no problem, there's only 5 people sick, then there's only 15, there was only 129, and so on up to 546 a few days later. But all through that, the Trump government, and including and also the UK government and many Western governments especially, had similar kind of mentalities, similar sort of feelings that this is a linear situation, it's all under control. And of course, we entered the second half of the exponential, and suddenly a week after, you know, our Prime Minister was telling us that we didn't need to lock down, we were locking down. So exponentials are extremely disorientating when they start to enter the second phase. And I hope that if we've gained anything from this horrible experience with COVID-19, is that we've gained an appreciation of how exponentials work, because we're in one right now on climate, and it's going to have a similarly but much larger scale bewildering effect on us in just a few decades' time, if not sooner. So let's look at that exponential now. This is exponential 1 of the 2 we're going to study. And of course, it looks a bit like this. Now, very similar to the last one, of course, but what I've laid over here are the different, excuse me, the different forces that are causing us to still act like there's no crisis coming. So first of all, again, we're struggling to process the idea of being an exponential. I think most people emotionally, if not intellectually, believe that actually, you know, the weather's going to be kind of similar next year and the year after, and it's not really going to change. Despite the growing evidence, there's a huge amount of sunk costs in maintaining things the way they are, our gas, oil, and coal infrastructures around the world, all the businesses that are built upon them, our lifestyle and its convenience. You know, these things are all very difficult to give up. So there's huge vested interests around maintaining the business models of the fossil fuel industry. And as a result of that, there's a massive lobbying effort that goes on to ensure that governments don't really take any meaningful action with a sense of urgency. So, for example, in the US last year alone, the fossil fuel industry was subsidized to the tune of $650 billion, or in world terms, we spent $11 million a minute. That's $5.9 trillion in total, subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. So that doesn't sound like a species that's really grappling with an oncoming crisis. It sounds like we kind of believe things are going to continue just as they always have. And indeed, if you look at our performance, we are now here. So we've passed the flat part. We're now starting to see the consequences of that in action, where we saw terrible conditions in countries in Africa with flooding last year. We saw the same in Europe. We saw the same in China. We saw another year of almost unlivable conditions in parts of North America. We're starting to experience the mild version of what's coming, but we're still stuck in this sense that we ought not to take any real action, not really. And you can see that in our charts. So this is Britain's performance on cutting greenhouse gas emissions. It looks an awful lot better actually to 2020 than it really is, because these charts conveniently miss out the fact that we have exported a lot of our carbon generation to other countries, and then we import their products as a result. So a real drop since 1990 is estimated to be about 15% in emissions. And the target that we're heading to, this 2050 net zero target, is already something that we're trending away from, not towards. So, it's important to remember that the 2050 target is not some special year. It's a politically convenient year because it's far enough away from current politicians' tenures to not worry about too much. But in 2050, if we get to net zero in 2050, we'll already have built in a whole bunch of catastrophic extreme conditions for our children and their grandchildren in the future. So this is not something to over celebrate, but we're not even trending anywhere near that right now. And if you look at the US, it's a very similar picture, trending, basically flat. The reason we're kind of flat is because in the UK, for example, moving from very polluting coal to gas is a bit of an improvement. And after that, there's not a lot left to do unless you get more extreme, and we're not really getting more extreme in our actions yet. So we're all starting to flatline. Now, this is what system scientists call a tragedy of the commons. And the idea here is that if you imagine a village with a commons grazing area, and each villager can graze a head of cattle on that ground, well, one day one of the villagers, of course, realizes that he can add a second cow and get all the additional economic benefits, or double the benefits of doing that. And he can spread the damage done to the commons across all the villagers. So he privatizes the rewards, and he socializes the consequences. And of course, other villagers eventually copy what he's just done, and then he adds a third cow, and so do they. Until one day, the commons becomes grazed out, it collapses as an ecosystem, and the cows starve and the villagers starve. And this is a tragedy of the commons. And we right now are trapped in an almighty tragedy of the commons on this planet, because for many years we've been privatizing the benefits of burning carbon, and we've been socializing and passing on the consequences not to other people in the current age so much as to our grandchildren. We've said, well, technology in the future will deal with this. That's been our belief system for a very, very long time. Climate change is not a new phenomenon. President Lyndon Johnson, back in the late 60s, was briefed about the dire consequences of climate change. It's not a new thing, but we've socialized the consequences to our grandchildren. It doesn't say a lot for us as a species, but that's how we've addressed this situation. So what we do instead is we say, well, technology will help us here. And undoubtedly technology is part of the solution, but let's be very realistic here. First of all, most of what we call tech today is contributing to the climate catastrophe. It's not alleviating it. And some of that tech is accelerating it. Let's look at the contribution first of all. Here are just a few of the platforms that we all know pretty well. And you can see that platforms like Amazon and Google, because they're cloud services, essentially they own the emissions of many of our other businesses, are running, in the case of Amazon, about a third of all the household lighting power consumption in the US, Google about a quarter. And both of those are larger than many states in their entirety in the US. So tech has a significant footprint. This session we're having today will use somewhere between 0.5 and 1 kilogram of carbon. So, if it was being run in a country which got its power sources from the conventional mix that most do. So tech's, got its issues. And in that red box, we also have accelerative technology. It's accelerating climate change, that is. So for example, we talk a lot nowadays about blockchain, and it's a very powerful technology, and it's, it's got a lot of great uses. Its primary application today, which is Bitcoin, uses more power than an average European country. And for what? Financial speculation. We are also using new digital mapping and other technologies to access oil fields that were previously non-viable. So there's a lot that we're getting wrong in tech. There is a section of tech, which I've called here primary climate tech, that partly contains the seeds of our salvation alongside other significant measures, which we'll talk about in a second. And there's a secondary category of climate tech, the kind of apps and data crunching tools, etc., which provide some ancillary benefit, but don't have a direct impact in the same way as primary climate tech. So let's look at that section of primary climate tech, while noting that as an industry in tech, there's an awful lot we've got to do along with everybody else to come to terms with the tragedy of the commons that we're all currently a part of. But the primary climate tech takes us to our second exponential, and this is the technology exponential. So the picture I've painted so far is one where if we continue as we are, with all the commitments that have been made, if those commitments are delivered, that we will reach a point of catastrophic warming in less than 80 years' time, by the end of the century. And the best advice that we could give our children now, if that continues, is not to have children of their own. So they're not coming into a world of chaos and conflict and disorder and mass migration and water shortages and food shortages and so on, and extreme weather events. That's currently where we're going. Now let's add the technology dimension to see if maybe there's some signs of hope. I think the first thing I would say that according to all the experts in this area, the technology will not save us on its own. We need to put that alongside significant changes in how we live our lives. But let's look at the potential of that technology. This exponential operates almost kind of in reverse of one we've been looking at, certainly graphically speaking, because whenever a new technology is launched, including primary climate tech, it usually always starts off in a very non-viable state. It doesn't really work that well, and it's extremely expensive, and nobody thinks it's ever going to amount to anything. So we tend to think about tech's improvement curve a bit like this, and it's going to get a bit better, but not too much better, because again, we can't really think very easily in terms of exponential. So I think we all remember, for example, or just don't remember, but you'll have heard the chairman of IBM back in the 1940s estimating the total market for worldwide computers, allegedly, this is attributed to him, of about 5 computers. That's what the world will need. But even much more recently, in the mid-1980s, when the Bell Telecom Company commissioned McKinsey, a very sophisticated an analyst company, to estimate how many mobile phones would be required in America by the year 2000. Their estimate, which I'm sure came at a significant consulting cost, was about 900,000 phones. And of course, the real number was over 100 million by then. So they were out by a factor of over 100. So we're just not very good at estimating how technologies might develop. And in that context, there is hope. So if you put solar energy on this chart, for example, what we can see here is that back in 1975, the cost per watt of solar energy was about $100, which made it affordable for highly expensive satellites and the occasional Casio calculator, but clearly not as a technology to replace fossil fuels. By 2019, and it's dropped even more since then, but by 2019, the cost was 23 cents per watt, so an improvement of about 430 times, which is quite extraordinary. And of course, that has completely changed the viability of solar energy. And if you put solar energy in the context of other similar technologies, so even in the last 10 years, the cost of solar energy has dropped by down to about by 90%. Winds, which we're very familiar with here in Scotland, all its forms and all its exploitations, it's dropped by 70%. Batteries, which are incredibly important to the other two sources, because when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, these sources tend to obviously be less effective. So we can store their excess generation in battery power. Battery power has dropped by almost 90%. And these technologies are all expected over the next 10 years to continue to very significantly reduce in cost, so that by 5 years hence, the cost to run these technologies, it will be about a quarter of pre-Brexit gas prices. So even with all the lobbying and all the attempts to extend existing fossil fuel business models that have knotted and tied up our politicians across the world, it starts to become extremely compelling to look at those kind of prices, and that continue drop ought to massively accelerate deployment. And we are starting to see that happen. Now let's look at another technology that's going to be important, and that's carbon capture. Now, every country on Earth pretty much has assumed that to hit their 2050 targets, whilst we know that 2050 is far too late, but to hit those targets, they're going to have to use a technology that doesn't really exist yet, which is carbon capture. The best carbon capture devices on Earth, of course, are called trees, but we've decided that the best thing to do with those is to cut them down as fast as we possibly can. So instead, we're starting to look at carbon capture technology. Now, this is the largest carbon capture facility in the world in Iceland, and it currently captures about 4,000 tons of carbon per year, which it may or may not sound like a lot to you, but it amounts to 3 seconds worth of global emissions. So clearly, it's completely non-impacting on our current situation. But if we put that on the same graph we've just been looking at for solar and wind and other energy sources, there's every possibility, as we'll go on to talk about, that it could rapidly move down this curve and become a viable part of the mix. That will depend heavily on adoption, as we will see, because adoption drives the sort of changes that we're looking at here. But we shouldn't write it off at this stage, because we've seen the same happen with other technologies in this space. Let's take another example, fusion. Now, fusion has been a bit of a joke in the science community for many years, because it's always coming in 30 years' time. But recently, there's been enormous advances in fusion technology. So even like less than 10 years ago, if you'd asked the most knowledgeable scientists this question, they would have said that to build an experimental, not a production, but an experimental working fusion reactor would probably take another 20 years and cost about $30 billion. But right now, because of massive advances in recent years in various technologies, including superconducting magnets, there's 2 startups in the US, and maybe others, but there's 2 I know about, that are trying to get a working reactor by 2025 with significant power output of about 100 megawatts. So it would be extraordinarily transformational if we could actually get fusion over the line. It's interesting, as an aside, that in America, for example, the government has invested annually about $670 million in fusion, which, as one scientist put it, is just enough for it not to work. Meanwhile, $650 billion in fossil fuel subsidies. So you can see that we've still got a lot to sort out in our thinking, and the tech alone is not enough if we still continue with these extraordinary decisions. But fusion is becoming a viable technology, and probably will be in our lifetimes. Is it soon enough? I don't know. But what it is is a technology that's large enough to fit the size of the problem. So, and doesn't create a waste problem like pretty much every other technology we've looked at other than wind and solar. And then what's driving these changes? Well, why should we believe that tech can cause us to ride down this exponential and become incredibly, not just viable, but incredibly compelling from a cost perspective? Well, one of the reasons is Moore's Law, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. Moore's Law is named after one of the Intel co-founders, Gordon Moore, who in 1965, it's not really a law, more of an observation that chip power doubles roughly every 18 to 24 months. That formula has been tweaked over time, but it's still a pretty extraordinary effect. So the graph you're looking at on the right here, it doesn't look like it between 1975 and 2000, but the chip power was doubling almost annually or every 18 months during that period. It's just what's happened is that doubling has got to massive scale on the right-hand side is it causes the graph to go flat like we saw earlier with exponentials. So what that means is in the last few years, the processing power available to us has become astonishingly high. So for example, even just last week, Apple announced its latest chips for its laptops, and one of those contains 57 billion transistors, which is just an extraordinary amount. The PC I had in 1990 had 24,000 transistors in the microprocessor. So it's just an extraordinary advance. And what that's doing is it's unlocking the ability to access technologies that were previously just too slow, such as deep learning and advanced deep learning algorithms are being used in all sorts of areas to massively accelerate our ability to do things. So for example, the Moderna vaccine was developed in months. And a big part of the reason for that was that the company was able to use advanced machine learning techniques and had the processing power to run them that took tasks that would take years normally and brought them down to just a few hours. So, Moore's Law is driving those kind of advances, but it's also in more frequently deployed and less powerful chips, meaning that we can equip devices with much more intelligence than before, much more cheaply, and that in turn is driving some of the benefits we've seen in things like solar and elsewhere, but also in our ability to model these technologies. The other reason that that's happening, which we don't often think so much about, is called Wrights Law, and it's named after Theodore Wright, who was an aeronautical engineer in the kind of 1920s and 30s, and he observed that every time they doubled the output of airframes for the planes they were making, the cost fell by a constant percentage, and that wasn't because of economies of scale. That is a factor, and you can buy more stuff more cheaply with economies of scale. But the actual effect that he was witnessing was that we get better at making things the more of them we make. So in other words, the more we adopt technologies, the better we get at making them, and we get a lot better at it. And therefore, adoption becomes incredibly important in accelerating our outcomes. So if you look at, for example, a technology that's very familiar to everybody, I'm sure, in this call, wind power. If you drive along the M8, you'll see different generations of turbines. You'll see, excuse me, turbines with pretty short blades, relatively speaking, and you'll see some turbines with enormous blades. And out in the North Sea, we're deploying turbines with 75-meter blades. Now, the reason we're able to do that is because as a world, we're making more and more turbines and getting better and better at it and learning how to make longer, flexible, stable, more aerodynamic blades. And what that's doing is for every time you double the size of a turbine blade, you quadruple its power output. So that's one of the reasons you see these enormous advantages in wind power. So this is Wright's Law. Price drops as adoption rises because we get better at making things. And combined with what we've seen implied by Moore's Law observation, we're getting to the point where we can very, very rapidly develop and decrease the price of major technologies. And that's causing us to get into this race that I mentioned at the start of this presentation between two exponentials. And the first one is the climate exponential in red, and the second is the primary green tech exponential. And it's a race in the sense that there's kind of two lines that really matter here. And the red line is the point at which we get to irreversible climate acceleration, climate change that we can't stop. I think people often think, well, if it gets bad, we can always kind of back up the road. We can't. For example, under the Siberian tundra, there are massive quantities of methane gas, and as the permafrost melts, as it's now doing, and those gases start to be released, and we've got a similar effect happening in the North Pole, for example, then those gases are far more impactful on global warming than carbon dioxide, and will cause the temperature to rise even faster, which will melt more permafrost, which will cause more methane release, and there'll be nothing we can do about that. So there is a point at which these conferences and so on just become what they really are, which is almost a waste of time, unless we act very, very significantly, because we won't be able to stop that climate change. Now, the other threshold is that if we can drive the price of key technologies low enough, it becomes so compelling to deploy them that no amount of lobbying, corruption, etc., slow walking can mask the fact that these technologies are far cheaper to deploy than the existing fossil-based alternatives. So we're in a race between these thresholds, and insofar as that goes, the earlier we can adopt the primary green tech to get to that threshold, you can see that the line moves backwards, and that takes us further away from the red line threshold. So what this tells us that adoption is extraordinarily important, or rather accelerating that adoption. And this is where I think Scotland comes to play. Now, let's be realistic. We are a very small country, and nothing we do will make a dent directly on the overall global warming statistics. But what we can be is a green demonstrator economy. We can demonstrate that, first of all, economy can move to being net zero or to being zero. We can demonstrate that that economy is not just viable, but can thrive. And I think that's something that we really ought to be trying to do in this country. We already have a leading position in wind power. More than 95% of our power, of our electricity, comes from wind power, which is great. And we saw with the oil industry that although we didn't necessarily always lead the world in every aspect of that, we had enormous expertise in deployment, operation, optimization, and maintenance. And although Scotland won't become a competitor to China, for example, in manufacturing and designing and developing wind turbines, where they spend $100 billion a year doing that, we're never going to compete with that. But we can be a world leader in the same way in adoption, consultancy, optimization, etc., of the green technology set. And this is one of the wind farms in Scotland, and one of those wind farms, Whiteley's Scottish Power, is already running a green hydrogen demonstrator, or building one right now, which will have a significant scale to it. And what that does is it takes excess wind power, which we have quite a lot in this country at many times, uses that to run a hydrogen electrolyzer, which creates very green production quality hydrogen, which can be used in many, many different aspects of life. We use a lot of hydrogen already in our economy, but it's generated by very expensive carbon dioxide generating mechanisms. And we can also use hydrogen to replace methane in a lot of uses as well. And in places where it's more difficult to drive electric vehicles, like large articulated lorries and so on. So this is another technology that Scotland can lead in its development and its deployment, just to name a couple of examples. But elsewhere, we're not doing so well. So, for example, Norway, a country not unlike Scotland, already has a situation where more than half, and getting on for 60% of all new cars, are electric. And they've done that because they've got their act together and rolled out a charging network. And we are, woefully behind in doing that in the UK, and that includes Scotland. And that's kind of like an own goal. We should be just doing a lot more there than we are, and not making excuses that there's lots of private companies and all that sort of stuff. This is a wartime situation. I can't think of a more terrifying scenario that's been put before the human race than the one that we're discussing here. we ought to get this stuff done and demonstrate to the world that it can be done. That has a lot of power. And looking to a different type of tech. So I think we all have been brought up to believe this is a beautiful environment, but where are the trees? We I think are quite comfortable in criticizing Brazil and Bolsonaro for chopping down the rainforests. We've already chopped ours down. This is the same geological land, same soil in Norway. We were once connected. Trees grow in this land, but we've cut ours down because we wanted to do sheep farming, or in more recent years, we burned saplings so that we can clear fields to do grouse shooting, which seems, kind of extraordinary. So this is a monoculture. I ever wonder why there's so many midges in Scotland and they're not under control with other predators? This is a monoculture we've created in Scotland. We need to be rewilding this environment. We need to be, generating a lot of jobs in the process, and I'm sure a lot of science and technology will follow, and we can be a demonstrator for that too. And I think we should. I know we're starting to grow trees, but our targets they're pretty tame. So we've got to get to grips with that. So another item is pollution. Now, we will never really change behaviors on this planet until energy sources are taxed according to their polluting damage that they do. As I mentioned earlier, worldwide, we spend $5.9 trillion doing the opposite every year, which is subsidizing these technologies. And in Scotland, 95% plus of our electricity comes from wind power, and yet gas is cheaper. Now, that can't be right. It's absurd. So, insofar as we can affect these things as the UK or as Scotland, we've got to be taxing pollution as according to its actual impact. What we do instead is we don't just avoid the externalities, we actually encourage the externalities from fossil fuel production. In the UK, we saw recently that Britain spends 10 times the amount of money subsidizing the fossil fuel industry than it does green industries. So we're not a world leader in anything to do with climate when that's true. Now, moving off climate, we need to remember that we have problems everywhere. And that, again, as Jack Ma once said, the great thing about problems is they invite solutions, they invite opportunity. So in the production of many materials we use on this planet, we use oil and coal to produce them too, and that has side effects. So if you look at this, it's what's called a Sankey diagram. It looks a bit complicated, but actually quite simple. If you look on the left-hand side, we can see the volumes and types of raw materials we use to make the products on the right here. You can see my mouse. So let's look at how much fertilizer we make. 275 million tons a year worldwide. Bear in mind, fertilizers are extraordinarily polluting. They're partly responsible for the collapse in our biosystems worldwide. And in this country, we have lost 75% of our insects since 1970, and that we'd already lost 75% by 1970. So 75% of what was left. So, we've got to ask ourselves, do we need the same quantities of these materials? Thermoplastics, that's your Coke bottles, still buying those. So we've got to cut down that right-hand side, but we also note here that these production processes produce about 270 million tons of carbon dioxide every year and about 43 million tons of methane, both obviously global greenhouse gases. So we've got to look at other ways of getting by here. And I think that invites us in Scotland to, with our great university base and science base and engineering base, to be part of the pioneering group doing that. There's enormous advances happening in synthetic biology, allowing us to grow materials we couldn't previously make other than with oil. There's a lot we can be doing here from a tech perspective to really contribute there. Meat production now, food production accounts for about 25% of our global emissions, and meat is about half of that. Look what direction we're going in just now on meat production in the world. So what are we going to do about that? Where are the solutions to that? Again, there's lots of opportunities for us in this country to deploy our creativity and contribute to these solutions, because someone's going to have to do it. It's going to have to be done. We can't continue like this. So in summary, we're on a race between these two exponentials, and the earlier we can drive adoption, then the further away safely we get from irreversible climate acceleration, which we're already dangerously close to. And I think in summary, that means that we should be a demonstrator economy to the world. I think the first point, which I haven't mentioned earlier in the presentation, but I think needs to be mentioned, is in our own businesses, insofar as what we control in our span of control, let's make sure we're first doing no harm. You know, what's our footprint against these issues? What choices are we making individually and in our businesses? After that, I think we can really, far from be a kind of hobbled economy because we're a demonstrator economy, we can accelerate adoption of existing technologies and harness the economic value that comes from that adoption expertise. And we can take a frontier position, as I was saying just a few moments ago, in emerging technologies. And we should also be very, very aggressively looking at other areas that aren't classically thought of as tech, around rewilding of Scotland, tax pollution. There's a lot of innovation required around how we're going to do those things, but these really need to be in the mix. And I think that's Scotland's contribution that it can make to the world to balance our prior contribution to this pending catastrophe. So I'll pause there and we'll look forward to thoughts and discussion from everybody.
My goodness, what a substantive content deck that was, and very challenging, particularly when you look at the global stats that you were able to share there, Mark. And yeah, very, very thought-provoking. So thank you very much for that. And yes, I'm absolutely sure that bringing it into the room, that those that you have in the audience here will be a game for rising to the challenge of contributing to becoming a sort of demonstrator economy. And certainly Glasgow has been trying to do its bit, at least in part, to progress towards a more circular economy approach through the Circular Glasgow work the Chamber's been doing. The city's now moving towards circular economy ambition by 2045 for the city. Noting your comments on net zero targets 2050, awfully far away. I think there are many people that will agree with that. And I suppose Scotland's been ambitious in bringing it more closer to home, but Glasgow's gone for 2030. So, you know, getting from here to 2030 and the various levers that need to be pulled in order to reach some of those targets are going to be key and going to take us into a lot of the areas that you've touched on today in terms of energy in particular, consumption, and I guess consumption itself is a topic which our colleagues and friends at Zero Waste Scotland have been investing a lot of content around it of late. You talked about materials. We've talked about the use of fuels and so on and so forth. But I think to parallel that up, there's also the kind of issue of global population growth, which is going to be going on as we go in this journey of your exponential challenges. So there's some magnificent thinking that's going to happen with the policy players, and obviously what's happening in Glasgow in the next couple of weeks through COP will be key to that. So in the first instance, could I just remind everybody, if you'd like to bring a question into the room, would you just raise your hand using the reactions function? And I see in the very first instance, I'm going to bring in Adam Bastock. Could you just say which company you're from before you bring your question in, please, Adam?
Yes, so Adam here from Small 99. So we work predominantly with small businesses to help guide them to net zero and accelerate that transition. And I think there's 2 points I wanted just to pick up on very quickly. One, I think the midges comment was great, and maybe that's the way we can accelerate the rewilding is by marketing the midge thing slightly more. But more seriously, was around you spoke quite a lot around the subsidies that fossil fuels are getting, which I think is a very good and quite disheartening point, really, when you see the sheer scale of what we're doing with renewables or not doing. But the question really is, how do we address that? How can we start influencing that, do you think? And how do we, especially on this kind of small business and also kind of consumer side, how do we start influencing that policy and start undoing that change to make sure that Scotland is positioned as strongly as it can be?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Thank you for your question, Adam. I mean, I was watching with interest over in the US, President Biden, trying to get his infrastructure bill through the political system over there. And the fact that because all the Republican senators will just en masse, vote against any climate-based legislation because they're all heavily paid for or corrupted by, is the word I prefer to use, by the fossil fuel industry. And there's one Democrat senator who also refuses to support that because he's from Virginia and he gets paid by the same people. So therefore, they've had to take out their plans to deprecate coal and build lots of windmills along the coast. So you've basically got a political system in America, and I'm going to bet that it's not that different in a lot of other countries, especially the UK. I think we've already seen how money moves behind the scenes to stop politicians acting at a UK level. So I'm going to bet that it's going to take an awfully long time to unstick that. I think that this is a classic case of disruption. Different companies are going to have such a compelling deployment scenario that eventually these models have to die. It's like in tech, we always say if you want to disrupt an existing solution, it has to be 10 times better in some way. And I think that's really the bar we're going to have to drive, because we've seen that nothing else really changes anything from, because this all becomes a monetary equation. The other variable is to what extent the protests of the people in different countries, including our own, has an impact. I mean, so far it hasn't. So far, despite extraordinary individuals like Greta Thunberg and what she's achieved, politicians have only really got better at saying warm words, and as she would put it, blah blah blah. I think she said they haven't started to act, and I think it's because they still believe that most people, the so-called silent majority, doesn't want any change, and that's probably true, because we're all a bit stupid when it comes to this stuff. We can't process exponentials. So I think until the tech becomes incredibly cheap and compelling, and until enough people raise their voices and protest against this current failure of this generation towards the next, I think it's going to be difficult to make the aggressive wartime-like progress that we need to make. We've got to create a sense of crisis in this country and elsewhere for us to act. And I think however we do that, I think that's the key.
Yeah, I think that is important. And I think one of the things that I noticed was a couple of years ago, at the time, the Secretary General of the United Nations put the world in a red alert. And there was staggering silence in the media coverage of that report a couple of years ago. And he came out again and said it this year. And yes, there was substantive media coverage because there's greater focus on it. But at this particular point in time, there's not been a significant shift to the dramatic changes that you're talking about. So I wonder if we could start maybe looking at how do we bring that into the room in terms of some of the funding points that you've made, for example. And one of the things we've heard from our members as an example is that trying to access innovation funding, particularly with tech in mind, is actually really very difficult for our SME community, and the failure rate's really high. So if you just take that one example and then look at the wider investment opportunities for the business community to try and drive through some of these solutions, have you got any views based on the work you did on the tech system report about how that can be accelerated to help stimulate that change? Because it's almost like everything's a wee bit stuck, and how do we unlock that a bit better?
Yeah, I'll address that question in 1 second, but just on your comment about the UN Secretary General, Alison, it's interesting that he said recently that the current trajectory we're on is going to create a hellscape for people on this earth. And despite the UN Secretary General saying that we're heading towards a hellscape, as he put it, and despite the IPCC report, which was released a few weeks ago, describing calamitous conditions in just a few decades, that report was on the news channels for about a day and then it disappeared. Now, what does that tell us about us? It tells us that we don't like the sound of it, so we're just going to ignore it. That's what it means. Television channels show you either what the government tells them to show or what we want to watch, and we don't want to talk about this. So I think we've got to somehow break out of that bubble, that first half of the exponential, and start facing the reality and act with a sense of crisis, which we can do. we've for better or worse performance in different countries, we have acted with a sense of crisis with COVID, but we wouldn't get the chance to do that in the second half of the exponential. It'll be too late with climate. Now, your question about how do we unblock funding? If you look at all the technologies we just talked about, so wind, solar, battery, all of these technologies were essentially funded by governments originally. Because no VC wanted to go near them in the early days because they were just too expensive and too risky. So if we really want to develop these technologies to the point where the investment industry is interested, i.e. where the risk is low, then we've really got to put masses of government money into doing that. And my vote would be not spend $4 billion a year in this country on fossil fuel subsidy, but spend it in doing exactly this. Now, it's great that in Scotland we have the recently formed Scottish National Investment Bank, for example, which is really one of these institutions that's designed to do that kind of stuff. Obviously, Scotland isn't a large country, so the numbers are less, but I think that's how it gets started. Without the massive investments that were originally made by Denmark and then Germany and now China and then the US, from government institutions, wind power would be decades behind. We often extol the amazing things that Elon Musk's achieved with electric cars, and he has, and he's done an amazing amount of acceleration there. But he did that with $400 million worth of government support. So, he did really well with it. But governments have to be in this game, I think, to really get the progress. Because the VC money is risk averse. Whatever the industry likes to believe about itself, it's very risk averse.
And what, on that note, then, given that we are talking about government at this particular point in time, and given that we are going to have all of these world leaders here in our city in the next couple of weeks, I mean, what do you think is the biggest thing that they can actually agree based on the content that you've been able to share with us here today, if humanity is going to show the leadership that is clearly needed?
Well, I think we should all have very low expectations for COP26. We saw that in the last conference, the Paris conference 6 years ago, the kind of cheering and rapture when we all agreed amongst our leaders to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. And since then, we've accelerated emissions. Even as we've had warm speeches from all sorts of, articulate world leaders, we've accelerated emissions. So I think that the best governments could do is put masses of money into developing these technologies, and some of them are doing that. Secondly, tax pollution according to the damage that fuel sources and other things do, which they won't do, but they should, and phase out subsidies over 5 years. And that horrifies a lot of people, but why? That's what they should do. That'd make an enormous difference. I don't have any expectation that they'll do anything like that. And instead, what they'll do is they'll do what the Australian Prime Minister did this morning when he announced that they're going to be net zero by 2050, but they're going to continue to their current coal exploitation till 2030. They'll do what President Biden's doing, which is speeches about climate at the same time as granting 2,000 oil drilling licenses since he got into power. I don't have high expectations for COP26. I think we've got to rely on the rest of us, to be honest. And that climate tech exponential, any way we can accelerate that, so much the better. But governments know what they should do; they just refuse to do it.
And I see Adam's got his hand up. I'll bring you back in again, Adam. If you were going to kind of reference more immediate examples of businesses in the climate and or green tech space from your own experience, have you got any examples of really good practice in this field generally here and actually globally that you might be able to bring in the room that would inspire some of our audience?
Well, at the moment, most pronouncements from larger corporates are greenwashing, let's be honest. Most of it is, I'm tired of seeing supermarkets appoint environmental directors and then package individual slices of vegetables in their own plastic wrapping. I think we've got to be really honest. that there's not a lot of leadership amongst any of us. There are companies in the forefront of green climate tech, and I think we've got to give them all the support we can. But at the moment, we've really got to take a long, hard look at ourselves. We're not fooling the climate. We might be fooling ourselves, and all of us have to ask, what pressure are we applying? What are we doing in our own businesses? And none of it's enough for 99% of our businesses, because we're all still living the tragedy of the commons. So I don't have a particularly positive message just now, Alison. I am deeply concerned that we're miles off course. And I think we need to have that sense of terror. We need to have that sense of urgency. And I'd rather talk about the negatives here than the positives, because I think we've got to start facing up to the fact that we are failing ourselves at the moment, and we're running out of time for our grandchildren.
Yes, I do have a large degree of sympathy with that comment. And at some point before the end, though, we would still be interested to hear of some examples of good businesses, though, because I think that's the kind of stuff that will help motivate individual businesses, individuals within businesses to actually take action. And it's the collective action that's ultimately going to help us get there. Before I do that, though, I'm going to briefly bring in Adam again, and then I'm going to come in to Neil Amner also. Maybe I could just bring both of your questions in at the same time, because I'm just mindful of time. Adam, I'll bring you in first, and then Neil.
Brilliant. Thank you. There's a very quick question really around that, the finance initiatives and all that stuff. There's the Mark Carney's heading up the GFANZ, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. I wasn't sure if you had any thoughts or kind of information around that really, and what your thoughts were on that as an initiative.
I don't know much about that, Adam, to be honest. I couldn't knowledgeably comment on that, so apologies.
No, that's good. I thought that might be the case. Yeah, not seeing much either. So.
Thank you, Adam. Neil.
Hi, Mark, and everybody. Mark, fascinating presentation, and thank you very much for it. I was really struck by your two comments. One, you're trying to do the commons analogy, and also your comment fairly early on about the amount of emissions from Bitcoin mining and managing blockchain, but also actually, but also really struck by your comment about the emissions that this particular call is generating by itself. And a couple of points on that. One, it kind of struck me that from what you were saying, that technology could be the savior, but also could be the final nail in the coffin. And so I guess, is there a need now to actually say to the generation who are between us and the one we're trying to save, ultimately, listen, guys, just pedal back on the social media, behave yourselves. Do we need to actually think about what data we are continually mining for the most trivial and obscure purposes? Back to supermarkets, why is every transaction, every footstep of your digital footpath and your shopping experience stored somewhere in a server? We must be killing forests to maintain this. And just a final query for you is actually, is there a balance to be struck there in terms of our digital footprint as well as our physical footprint? And as a Chamber of Commerce, we're obviously thinking about rebounding from the pandemic and that kind of stuff. We can see the impact of a city centre of people working from home, but actually, is there a climate aspect to this? Is everybody working from home and spending their lives in teams? Is that actually going to do more damage when it's all getting on an efficient public transport system to come to work?
Yeah, it's great questions, Neil. And I'll maybe give them a shorter time. I'll try and sort of roll my answer into a condensed response. I think the thing we've got to recognise is we're living in the exponential age now. And the issue that tech has is tech's very good at accelerating exponentials. So, you build a network and that grows with network effects. And what we don't think about in tech is that there's power driving that. So tech's always going to be a contributor to global warming until the point where we've got a green power source behind it. And that's only partial at the moment. So, you could deal with that two ways. One is you could accelerate the green side of the power source, or you could think about the footprint of power that we're generating, like with Bitcoin or with storing all your photographs for the last 25 parties you were at and all this kind of stuff. I'm not sure how you implement the second policy. I suspect the easiest path is a drastic and rapid switch to green generation. As regards, this conference and the power it's using, if you do the models, getting in a car and driving to a meeting is still more expensive. So my point isn't that these aren't helpful, but we shouldn't be fooling ourselves that we're operating at green zero here. we've got to get a grip on the primary generation sources of carbon and other greenhouse gases. And we often feel ourselves by saying there's a great initiative at the local company X because they've got rid of plastic straws. And that's kind of good. But we've got to recognize that these are 3 orders of magnitude below the damage that's been done by power generation, large scale plastic production, and so on. And we've got to belly up to that bar. And until we see that happening, then I don't have any, to go back to Alison's point, great case studies to celebrate, because I don't want to be moving deck chairs around on the deck while we're heading for the iceberg. And right now, that's exactly what a lot of our discourse encourages us to do. Isn't it great that we've cut 1 journey a week? We've got to get on top of these massive polluting engines that run our whole economy. We're not doing that just now.
Neil, you happy with that?
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm very mindful of time. I suppose just to conclude then, I wonder that if we could just ask, how can people in the room get involved? How can people in the room get engaged, and what action can they do from today? Because you've made a very strong call. I understand the tone of voice is negative. I understand why you've done that. But equally, most of the people in this room will want to take some sort of action beyond maybe what they were doing prior to coming into this session. So what can you leave us with in terms of the action that the people in the audience can actually take away today, Mark?
Well, I would love us all to be acting like we're in a crisis in your conversations, in your businesses, in the lobbying you do with government. That would be a great start, because we're not talking like a species facing its own extinction in the next century. And that's where we are. And I think we've got to start talking that way. So I think that's one thing we could do, because until we accept we're in this crisis, we're not going to act. And the more of us that are talking that way, and we're all to blame, and none of us are to blame, but we're individually to blame if we don't start talking about the seriousness of the situation. So that would be my ask.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much indeed today. As I say, very challenging content, and the session has been recorded, so we will make sure that this is exposed to as many of our members as possible in terms of making that call to action and challenge and getting that out beyond the people in the room today. So with coming to the end of the session today, I suppose my first thing is to thank Mark very much indeed for that. As I say, very challenging content and plenty for us to go away and consider. And I'm quite sure that we'll be able to get access to the deck thereafter after today's session. There's a few events that we would like to promote, which we are doing as a chamber during the course of COP. We've taken the role that the chamber has as host city and as host city chamber very seriously, on the basis that we're in a position that we can broker some of the wonderful connections that are coming into town to help with spreading of messages of positive action and businesses that are pivoting and so on and so forth. So we've got the Climate Chamber Signature Series, and we've got a range of different keynotes in that, from Pekka Lundmark, who's the Global Chief Executive of Nokia, on the 3rd of November. We have Greet Fermeno, the United Nations and UNOPS Under Secretary General and Executive Director, on the 4th of November. We have Stefano Agostini, who's the Chief Executive of UK and Ireland of Nestle. And indeed, we have Professor Mohammed Yunus, who's the Nobel laureate professor from the Tokyo Games, to take the Paris Olympics in as a green event offering. Please do go and look at the Chamber website for further details on those, and you're very welcome to join us for those. And of course, we do have a COP26 closing reception, which will be after an event that we're doing with our young people to inspire them about the opportunities to get into the workplace to actually make a meaningful difference in their own work as they come out of the education system around fast fashion, which we hope will be becoming slow fashion. So I think my last task today is to say thank you very much again to Mark, and thank you very much to each of you for giving up your time for coming today. Very, very strong content, and I hope you found it inspiring, and I hope that you will go away and actually take some serious action and spread that message to your peers. Thank you very much.